So today, Pax Americana and Europe. I would like to start with one question, and it's a non-academic question. None of this will be actually particularly academic in the theoretical sense. But if you want to ask questions about how this relates perhaps to integration theory or something like this, please let me know. The first question that I have is, what is Europe? And I'm not going to give you a definition, the standard kind of geographical or political definition, but I would like to actually single out three factors that make Europe, I think, and are structural elements in what is Europe, and which are relevant then to the second question, what is happening in Europe. The first one, it's a very broad and general statement, but something that we tend to forget because it's not an experience that we've had in our lifetime. And that is the fact that Europe is a structurally unstable continent. When you look at European history for the last 2,000 years since the Roman Empire, or you go even further back, up another 500 or 800 years into the Athenian time, and then even beyond this, you will find a continent that has been structurally unstable, where dominance and rule is not a settled issue, and where security and stability is actually the exception, and turmoil and war and conflict is the rule. And this is a very important thing to bear in mind, because we tend to believe that this very exceptional phase since 1949 or 45 or maybe in the mid-50s, wherever you put the starting point, of stability that we've had, that's actually really very much the exception. And you could say to a degree that it is an artificial stability that we've had. That's already my second point. The stability that we've had since the 1940s or 50s is a period of artificial stability. It is mostly, it was mostly possible, or has been possible over the last 7 decades or so, because of the US presence on the continent. And not everybody likes that in Europe, to also understand that truth is actually, a quite important political one. But, American presence in Europe came in two forms. The first one was, military presence that was there for the most part for protecting Europe from a Soviet invasion. But the other presence that came with that, and that is often the overlooked presence, was probably actually as important, if not more important, than the military presence. And that is the fact that when America became the dominant military power of Europe, a non-European power became, for the first time in European history, the dominant military power in Europe. The old rivalries between the European powers basically died away. The Germans and the French and the Austrians and the Swedes and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Russians, all of whom had fought each other for 2,000 years, all of a sudden that rivalry was over. The Germans and the French in particular could all of a sudden start collaborating with each other without fearing that the other one would be more powerful or more beautiful or more potent. So American presence settled the issue of European rivalries. That was an unbelievable factor in stabilizing the continent. It was what I call a trust infusion. By actually being there and by being the arbiter of last resort and by being the protector, indirectly, an enormous political trust infusion came into the European political market and pacified the continent just as much as the Marshall Plan helped building it up or the American presence protected it from invasion. This is a very, very important thing to remind yourself of, especially when you look at the history since 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ever since then, the American presence, both the political and the military presence, has been systematically diminished. So that currency, both the military and the trust currency that I was talking about, has been actually taken out of the European market. And my argument is that some of the turmoil that we're seeing at the moment is a result of that withdrawal of trust capital from the European market. It's not the entire story, but it's a huge part of the story. And then the third factor that I think makes Europe is that it is really in this arrangement of what we call the West, and we're in the western part of the West here, that Europe is the easternmost extension of Pax Americana, the easternmost extension of what is the West. It's the front line to the east. When you're in Germany, you don't feel that very much. When you're in Poland or in Latvia or in Romania, where I was just a few weeks ago at a conference, you feel that very strongly. The debate on America, on the European Union, on Russia is markedly different in Bucharest than it is in Berlin. You feel that you're on the eastern extension of Pax Americana. And that, where your border ends, that American rule, that part of the world where American arbitration is the final word on issues, or at least used to be the final word, ends there, and then something else begins. And so these three factors, historically unstable, artificial stability for the last 7 decades, and the easternmost extension of Pax Americana, these are the three structural factors that I would single out here. You could frame the debate about Europe in 100 million ways. This is the way that I would like to frame it, because I think for the geostrategic balance, which is the topic of this talk, these are very, very crucial and decisive factors. That brings me to the second question. The second question is what is happening right now in Europe, and what is it going to lead to? I think is to cluster it and make it kind of convenient and simplify it a little bit. And simplifying is great in this context, because when you simplify in a pretty drastic way, as I do, for the sake of making this short and comprehensible, the great thing is that afterwards you're never responsible for anything that you've said, because it was just so simplified. But just to put it into kind of digestible chunks, I think there are 4 general trends that we see playing out in the European political market in the widest sense. The first one is that the stability creation that was put in place after the Second World War is under tremendous pressure from within. And you had a discussion just before I started about your own elections just now, and the forces that drove that election and the outcome. And most of these forces, in one way or another, are at play in Europe as well. Tremendous pressure on established political systems from within, for a whole variety of reasons. I will just, enumerate them very quickly, because each one of those probably, deserves a full talk or a full conference even. But, these are at play, and I would like to just, list them very quickly. One is that we have a similar phenomenon like the one you have here, which is a pretty systematic economic pressure on the middle classes. You have actually diminished the buying power and the household income of middle classes over about a generation, since the 80s. I think in 1975, 65% of US household income was middle class income. In 2015, it was something like 35%. So from 2/3, you've reduced it to 1/3, and similar numbers apply in Europe as well. And what that means is that you actually put pressure on those parts of the political spectrum that guarantee that you don't get radical politics, the boring part of the political spectrum, the classic center-left, center-right middle ground. Those you systematically put under pressure, people will start to move elsewhere, because that middle ground doesn't help them very much any longer for their own economic well-being. In addition to this, what you also have and what we have playing out in Europe, and which puts pressure both at the state level, at the nation-state level, and at the EU level, is what I call sophisticated state failure. Sophisticated state failure is a situation where you have functioning states. All of the institutions are basically okay and work. You have elections and a peaceful change of power. You have the tax authorities that work. You have the police that works, and the courts, the judicial system. Everything, by and large, works, and yet nothing gets done. Everything works, but nothing gets done, for me, is the definition of sophisticated state failure. And what I mean by this is that you don't solve the big problems, the obviously big problems that have been around for so long, but you don't seem to have the political stamina or the political capital to actually, attack them. In Europe, there are quite a number of examples. I will just give you a few. You haven't had pension reform in the United Kingdom for 25 years, and that is a running gag in British politics. Everybody knows the pension system can't go on like it has been going on, and yet nobody finds the power to actually do it. Even prime ministers with a fairly stable majority in parliament would not touch the bloody thing. In Germany, you haven't had tax reform in 30 years. A horribly complicated tax system. Nobody dares touching it and simplify it and make it more attractive for citizens and investors and for everybody, essentially. And nobody seems to have the power to do it and the will. France is notoriously reformable both in its labor market and in its social system. Every president since Mitterrand has tried to do something about it. Every president got shot down. It has not worked in even 40 years, perhaps. And you find more examples of this kind, whether that's infrastructure or education or military reform or whatever you want to look at. Almost every single political field is working, under sophisticated state failure. What that means is that you have, of course, politics is enormously busy and you do all kinds of reforms all the time, but they're small reforms. It's the small stuff. And politicians, because they can't get the big stuff done, what they tend to do is they sell the small stuff as big stuff. They make you think that this small reform was really horribly difficult to get done, and it really should be considered a big reform. What's true is it was horribly difficult to get done. What's not true is that it was a big reform. It just wasn't. And so some of the most important underlying structural issues of society are being left unattended. This very good example from recent political memory is the immigration question. Again, we have a situation where for 40 years, I'm now talking about the German market specifically, for 40 years politicians in Germany have known that they need to come up with a regulated way of organizing immigration into Germany. But what happened was that both the political left and the political right were against coming up with an immigration law, both for their own very different reasons. The political right feared that if you do have an immigration law, the floodgates would be opened and all of those people would come in. The political left feared the exact opposite. If you actually did an immigration law, that meant that everything would be heavily regulated and nobody could come in any longer. And they didn't trust each other, and so we had a de facto grand coalition against immigration reform. So for 40 years, no immigration reform, even though this was an issue and has been an issue in public debate for just as long. People wanted reform and wanted change, but the political forces didn't deliver it. And when the refugee crisis broke last year and became really, really difficult, and everything got mixed into the same kind of stew, refugees are quite a different thing from immigration. All of a sudden we were naked because we didn't have anything that we could actually use or kind of orient ourselves alongside. So we had a classic state failure in light of a pressing, urgent problem that has been around for so long. The demographics of Europe are another example for that kind of failure. Again, the numbers are quite clear as to where the demographic development goes, but nothing really much has been done to address the issue. So what happens, if you have sophisticated state failure for too long, people will start to actually not believe in the promises any longer. If you start to, promise them change and new horizons and a better future and rising suns and all of this stuff, and then you don't deliver for 30, 40 years, people go elsewhere for answers. And this is where I think the elite distrust comes from. Apart from corruption and apart from, a wealth that shouldn't be there at the top of the state and all of these arguments that you read in the paper about, I think one of the underlying issues is that basically the political elites have not delivered for 30 years. And so now people look for easy solutions elsewhere, and they find people who offer them easy solutions, and the simple truth which do not apply to complex problems. As part of that first internal pressure package, I need to add to the mix, apart from middle-class squeeze and sophisticated state failure, also our own kind of European identity politics. Because, of course, in all of that time we've had immigration, but we have not really had much of an integration policy. Hasn't really worked very well. Parts of the immigrants have been integrated well, but mostly because they really actually wanted it. The other part that is more difficult to integrate wasn't also really forced very much. We have been tremendously lazy about integrating, the people that we invited to come over to us. And that has now created, as a response, identity politics on the other side of the fence, where people fear that more of those unintegratable people are coming in and are taking away kind of, the privileges of the old people that have always been there. And then fear starts to rise, and it's the same kind of fear that feeds into the Trump phenomenon, that feeds into our AfD symptoms in Germany, and to a much more massive extent into the identity politics in France, for example, where the alternative, in Germany the AfD is a fringe party. In France, Marine Le Pen and her Front National are scoring somewhere between 35 and 45%, in the projections for the presidential elections in May. That's not a fringe party any longer. That's where the process is already much further along. And you have similar phenomena in Austria, in the Netherlands, which is a very small political market, but a very important one because, the Netherlands, where I think you are from, right? And you as well, is traditionally, an outward-looking, seafaring, international kind of society, a liberal, open-minded society. And that my wife is from the Netherlands as well, she goes back to the Netherlands now and she doesn't recognize the place any longer, she tells me, because the debate is so different and the tone has so changed And so that kind of identity politics is putting pressure on those internal systems as well. Anti-elitism I have already mentioned. In the European context, in the EU context, which is very important to mention, we also have what we call renationalization. Much less of a willingness to actually seek the solution for problems at the EU level, but instead actually trying a national solution. Basically a bit of an instinct reversal. For a long, long time, the primary instinct of European countries was to actually try to find a solution at the EU level. Again, I'm simplifying a little bit. Now, over the last 5 to 8 years, we have seen a slow reversal of that trend, where member states now try to actually, find a solution first at home, thereby taking, the kind of currency out of the EU integration project as well. That's undermining the EU, among other factors that are undermining the EU. And then, of course, we have raw anti-globalization sentiments as well, both on the political left, predominantly on the political left, but also on the political right. And then we have our own version of post-factual, politics. Basically, lying is now something that is more or less acceptable, and doesn't have, at least, it's probably not much more acceptable, but you can get away with it, and it doesn't cost you as dearly political. People are still outraged, and yet it doesn't have too much of a consequence, which is an interesting phenomenon as well. This, in a simplified way, I would kind of cluster into the one trend that is happening in Europe at the moment, which is pressure from the inside on the political systems, both at the state level and at the EU level. The second thing that is happening is the external pressure, the pressure that's coming onto the system from the outside. And we have, a similarly colorful mix of factors that are putting pressure on Europe from the outside. Number one, of course, is Russia. Russia that for the last 2 or 3 years, for the first time, has actually defined itself as a player against the European post-Cold War order. Until about 2013-14, it still, defined itself as a partner in that order. It wasn't happy with some of the outcomes and some of the mechanisms, and it certainly wasn't happy, that there wasn't such a thing as a general security architecture that it wasn't part of. But it still defined itself as a partner in that general agreement that was, was made in the 1990s, the early 90s. In the last 3 years, that has changed. It is now defining itself as the power that wants to change this, that thinks that this is a fundamental flaw, the system, and that it comes at the expense of Russian interests. That is a very important reversal in the Ukraine crisis and some of the other frozen conflicts, and with respect to Georgia and others, Moldova. The role in the eastern Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, all of these factors, and of course the massive propaganda efforts that are doing in Europe, also partly in this country actually, but more so in Europe, need to be seen as part of this, cultural swing, where, Russia defines itself very differently as a player now than from a few years ago. The second factor, of tremendous external pressure is Turkey. Turkey is a huge power in the southeast of Europe. It is an 80 million people country, about the same population as Germany, only much younger. Very hungry, very good, well educated, lifted out of poverty by the Erdogan reforms of the early years of Erdogan. Very proud, very nationalistic, very much on the rise. And already that is changing the power balance in the region, and it will change the power balance of Europe as well, and it's starting to do so. And the Europeans don't really have too much of an instinct and of an instrument and of an attitude to deal with it in a constructive way. They thought that they had figured it out with, the accession process to the EU and with all kinds of other, very close relationships. But Mr. Erdogan, for the most part, actually destroyed that. The EU has done a lot of mistakes itself. It has for a long time been very, very dishonest with the Turks about membership, which caused a lot of chagrin and rightful chagrin on behalf of the Turks. But for the most part, the destruction has been done by Mr. Erdogan, who aspires to something very different now than he did in the beginning, and not really too much of a smart instrument for that on behalf of the Europeans. So that's, again, external pressure on the system in a very big and strategic way, especially if you also remind yourself that quite a large number of Turks are actually in Europe, in Germany, but also elsewhere, which do play a political role in their new European home markets as well. Another source of pressure from the outside, something that doesn't get a lot of press at the moment, but which is, quite explosive potentially, is still the Balkans. We have a situation in the Balkans where the wars of the mid-1990s have been resolved, obviously. They don't kill each other any longer. And yet political stability is not there, especially in Bosnia, but also in places like Macedonia and Kosovo, obviously. And in all of these places in relationship, with Serbia, none of that has really been resolved. The ethnic diversity issues have not been resolved. Minority status has not been resolved. Economic growth is very weak, and the prospects of becoming EU members have basically also kind of simmered away for most of these players down there. And so the future is bleak, and at the same time you see a relatively massive investment on behalf of Saudi Arabia and other Muslim players to promote political Islam in these regions, at least where Muslim minorities exist. They do in Bosnia, obviously, and so this is a problem because the Balkans, after the mid-90s wars, essentially became a Western protectorate, especially Bosnia under the Dayton Agreement. The Dayton Agreement was meant to be in place for about a year or two as a preliminary thing. It has now been effectively in place for almost 20 years as the kind of constitution of Bosnia. It gives the West certain reserve powers over the political development in the country. That is not sustainable. We have not really done a great job, especially the Europeans, at making that a priority. And our influence is slowly but surely going down and diminishing, whilst all of the ingredients for major conflict are still very much in place. If that blows up, interventions will become necessary, always a very tough sell anywhere. Plus, refugees will start flowing as well, as they did in the 90s. So that's a very difficult situation as well. Plus, the uncertainty in the region allows, as I said earlier, external players to actually come in and invest quite heavily, whether that's Russia, for example, in Serbia, or Saudi Arabia and others in Bosnia, or the Chinese, which are quite present in the region as well. On top of this, as a fourth factor, we have the refugee crisis, which is a relatively direct result and byproduct of the post-Arab Spring civil war that broke out in Syria, and which I don't really have to talk about at much detail because I think the general mechanics at play there. The Syria refugee conundrum illustrates one important point which applies to all of these external factors, but is most visible in this one because it's a hot war and it has had such a direct physical impact on European nations. And that is that all of these external pressures are coming from regions in the immediate neighborhood of Europe over which Europe has very little strategic leverage. It is not really a strategic player in any of these. Even if it wanted to, the ability to be that would be very, very limited. The European strategic tools, whether that's membership, as an incentive, a huge carrot that the Europeans can put out in order to change behavior of other players, or the interventionist approach, military power, that you can intervene and thereby change realities on the ground, or the trade policy instrument, you open markets and therefore use that as an incentive. None of these instruments really apply. And the other instruments that the Europeans thought that they had devised for themselves, particularly the neighborhood policy, which was an approach of very slow transformative action in those regions to actually turn them into better, more stable places, has pretty much miserably failed. So none of the big political instruments of the Europeans that the Europeans do have apply in those regions. So the Europeans rely, or no, let me put this differently, the Europeans experience pressure from regions in which their instrumentarium is extremely limited or has proven to be a failure. And that creates a sense of helplessness. And so that's an enormous psychological pressure that's coming along with all of those real political pressures. And we haven't even talked about North Africa, and then the Sahara and the Sub-Sahara African places like Mali or the Central African Republic, where we've seen conflict over recent years with European interventions actually happening on the ground. Most of them, of course, kind of fire-swatting exercises, not really going to the root causes of the issue, but still being forced to intervene, and more of this is to follow, particularly possibly in Libya, which is a completely failed state, and could very well turn into kind of the last refuge of ISIS, and then energy issues for Europe are very directly affected, and for the US as well. So we have this kind of perfect semicircle starting from Russia, going into the Balkans, and into the Middle East, and then into Northern Africa, which kind of half encircles Europe, and it's really pretty much, a circle of enormous political pressure from the outside. What's important to understand is that the European Union, which we all look at and kind of shake our heads and say, oh my God, what an enormous failure, we have to cut Brussels a little bit of slack, because the European Union was never really meant to be a decisive foreign policy player. Even in the Lisbon Treaty, which is the most recent founding document of the EU, foreign policy was not communalized, was not made an EU common policy. It was always meant to be a policy where the member states would hold a veto power, each single one. Again, I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's the raw mechanics of it. Which means that creating a common approach to any of these issues is extremely difficult, and this is why we've really only had what I call a case-by-case foreign policy. Every once in a while you have a combination of factors where the EU can come together, where it's possible, but in most of these cases, interests diverge too much. Traditional territorial connections, traditions, and mentalities clash in a way that makes it very difficult for the EU to be a unified player. And this insight was always reflected by the fact that the member states didn't want to give the foreign policy power to Brussels. So blaming the EU for not being, a unified actor on this is actually quite cheap. It's cheap currency. It is true, obviously, and there's much to be criticized about it, but the blame for this goes to the member states, who, despite enormous pressure and a clear necessity to actually come together and act as one, haven't done so. And so you have a situation where the external pressure is rising, but where the EU or the Europeans as such are quite a limited actor. So that's the second part in this game. Then there are two more trends which are of importance. The third one is the relatively systematic and very silent and discreet political investment of China into Europe, especially into Central and Eastern Europe. The Chinese are conducting their own foreign policy with 16 European countries. It's called 16+1, where they convene 16 European countries and China completely outside of any of the EU structures, uncoordinated with Brussels, and with the obvious aim of creating a constituency in Europe that can have influence at some point over EU policymaking. The hope is, with these massive economic investments in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in infrastructure, to gain leverage over these governments so that they, in the end, then also behave differently when it comes to voting in the European Council on EU foreign policy. We've already had one small example where that, was effectively visible. You all remember that case where a few weeks ago, one of those international tribunals handed down a verdict on the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, where China lost, but basically ignored the ruling. And the EU couldn't issue a statement on this because it couldn't find unanimity in the European Council, because a number of Central and Eastern European countries decided that that was not in their interest to let that happen. So we already have, in a relatively small case, not particularly interesting, but interesting enough as an indicator, we have seen this Chinese investment coming to fruition. This Chinese investment is not just one to kind of divide and rule Europe. That would probably go too far. But it must also be seen in the context of this big geopolitical project that China has been developing over the last couple of years, this One Belt, One Road initiative that you have heard about, which we have initially dismissed, or the New Silk Road as it also called. We have dismissed this very, instantly as one of those grandiose Chinese Communist Party schemes. But it is a very, very long-term scheme of connecting China to the decisive political and economic markets in the world. And in One Belt, One Road, Europe is, the other side of that bridge. It's the other bridgehead, essentially. And through a sea and a land route, China wants to connect itself and make itself a player, an important player in those regions. This is why the Chinese are buying systematically into harbors and into airports and into other infrastructure projects. And this is why they're massively investing in the Central Asian republics as well, in all of those stans. Traditionally the Russian sphere of influence, because that's the decisive link between the Chinese and the European market, much to the chagrin of Moscow, which is losing grip on these because they can't quite match the investment power that China can bring to the table. So the One Belt, One Road initiative must be seen as the kind of general scheme, the really big geopolitical plan that China has, and which the Europeans, and I think the West as a whole, doesn't really have much of an answer to. We don't do these grand schemes anymore. We don't even think them. And if we do think them, then everybody will tell you immediately we don't have the money for it. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. That's another trend that we should keep in mind when we look at the European market. And then the fourth one is the one that connects us to what I said initially in the very beginning of all of this. The fourth one is the systematic reduction of the American footprint in Europe. All of the above comes and happens and unfolds in front of the backdrop of that development, where the central stabilizer, the United States, has diminished its economic, it's not its economic, but its political and military footprint in Europe. I'm not of the opinion that America will abandon Europe altogether. The investment is just too strong and too important. There's not really another region of the world that is as good a partner and ally. And plus, if you look at it from a theoretic point of view, geopolitics, it's the countercoast that you don't want in turmoil. So American investment in Europe will stay. It will not completely disappear. But the question is whether it will be enough of a force to work as the stabilizing power that is required actually to keep that structurally unstable continent in place. We have seen after the Crimean annexation by Russia and the Ukraine crisis after that, a bit of a reinvestment. The Obama administration decided to reinvest with a couple of $1 billion over 3 years, some reinforcements, rotating troop presence, slightly enforced presence in Europe. All of this is extremely useful and was a good sign, was a politically necessary sign, I think. But if you really look at it and see how it is actually stretched out, it's nothing compared to the actual reduction that we've seen since the early 90s. And at the same time, the easy answer to that, of course, is the Europeans have to do them, more themselves. And this is now the frantic debate, after the Trump victory, obviously, that the strategic arguments for the Europeans to do more, which has been valid for 25 years, all of a sudden they realize, oh my God, it's actually true, which is something that they could have known years and even decades ago, but chose to ignore. Now all of a sudden there's some physical pain, coming up from this election result, where they realize that indeed they actually have to do more. And that is potentially of enormous explosive value politically, because the old transatlantic bargain between the United States and Europe was that the Americans would take care of physical security and the Europeans could save all of that money and actually invest it into pacifying their unstable societies. This is how the European welfare state, came all about, and this is where the money was generated for that kind of, internal pacifying mechanism. Now, if the Europeans have to actually spend at a level militarily where they have to defend themselves, something's got to give. The money needs to come from somewhere, and that will be an extremely tough bargain domestically, and it already is to a certain extent. When money needs to shift from one, social project to another social project. And the political debates in the future will get quite heated if Donald Trump is serious about undermining Article 5, the NATO guarantee, if he wants to turn that strategic, unconditional American security guarantee into a transactional guarantee, essentially into a financial transaction, where you only qualify for protection if you pay a fee for it, you change the entire nature of the political system in Europe, and you basically make Article 5 worthless. you create a political system or a security guarantee that functions as something that you actually buy, and that's not a strategic proposition. Not only is it potentially harmful for the Europeans, it's very harmful for American influence in the world, because if you systematically undermine your own security guarantee and your trustworthiness as America in the European market, that of course will be very closely observed in the Asian market and in the Middle Eastern market as well, where people have a very, very keen sense of how valuable and how reliable is the American security guarantee. To what extent can we rely on it? And already in the Asian market, where Mr. Trump has even just as much said as, why doesn't South Korea get its own nukes and Japan as well? Imagine what happens if the South Koreans and the Japanese decide to get their own nuclear weapons because America's nuclear umbrella is no longer there. The Chinese reaction is foreseeable, and the North Korean reaction and other reactions as well. It's going to create unbelievable political instability. This is something that Donald Trump has no inkling of when he says these kinds of things. He doesn't understand what it means if America says such a thing. And in the European market as much, there's one way of creating a complete nervous breakdown in the German society, and that is to start a debate about nuclear armaments. That's something that the Germans will not be able to swallow very lightly. And so much is at stake here. It all depends on whether Mr. Trump actually means what he has said about the value of the American security guarantee, and whether he is has just used this as a way of generating outrage in the campaign, or whether this is actually a real strategic consideration of his. We don't know that yet. We haven't really seen him in action. So these are the kind of long-term trends. We have still a couple more minutes. I would like to make one final point, and then I think we can go into the Q&A. And that final point is, and it is kind of the background music to this security guarantee stabilizing and structurally unstable continent story. And that is that when we look at the domestic debates in Europe, the debate on the euro, how to stabilize the euro, the debate on a stronger German defense commitment, and on other issues of that kind of the American investment in Europe and other points, for me really this debate is about the costs of keeping Europe stable. The European integration project, of which the euro is a part, Germany as a foreign policy player now bearing more responsibility than it used to, all of these are symptoms of a continent that's starting to find out how costly it actually is to keep a structurally unstable continent stable. The problem is that for a long, long time the European integration project created that sense of stability, but it is now seen as something that is costing too much. Many people look at it and say that's too costly for us. It takes too much of our own identity away, too much of our sovereignty. Plus it's this huge bureaucracy in Brussels, which by the way is not the case, but they say, wow, enormous buildings, great anonymous forces at play, and we have to pay for all of this. There's a fundamental uneasiness about the costs of keeping Europe stable. The same here in the United States, where I think all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, but over the last few years, an image has emerged that the U.S. security guarantees in the world are too much of investment. They cost us too much. All of those ships and units that we need to keep, active and that we need to pay for. That's too much of a burden on the American taxpayer. Again, a fundamental uneasiness about the costs of keeping Europe and other markets as well stable. And I think this is a strategic tragedy, that we think that the costs of keeping these places stable, which compared to the costs of having them unstable are minute. The actual costs of keeping Europe stable are not all that expensive when you compare it to turmoil and war in Europe. That is, that for me is a sign of a tiring it's a worn out strategic awareness of the world that we're living in. We have so gotten used to that stability that we have forgotten that it actually requires us to permanently invest into it. We now think that stability is actually something that's there anyways, so we don't need to pay for it any longer. And that's a fundamental mistake, I think, that we are making, both the Europeans and the Americans. The Europeans are more to blame because they have been ignorant of this for much longer. But the Americans, are to blame, are to be blamed as well because they used to understand this instinctively. The US strategic debate in Washington has always been a lot more educated than the one in Europe, but that is changing now too. And the number of people that you find in Washington who actually want to talk about Europe and understand the basic mechanics of Europe and the importance of the US presence in Europe is going down. You will still find your old usual suspects when you go to conferences, they're always there, but the number on the Hill and in the departments and so on and so forth is actually going down. And those Americans who are interested in Europe and who understand that Europe is an important strategic market for the US to invest in, if it doesn't want to lose Pax Americana, if it doesn't want this to frizzle out on the easternmost edge of Pax Americana, the ones are frantically, pressing the Europeans to do them a favor and give them something more that they can then carry back to Washington and use as an argument in Congress and say, here, look, Europe is a worthwhile investment. So we have a pretty precarious situation. It's not going to get any better with Mr. Trump, but it is not a Trump problem. The problem was already there. It only gets highlighted now more because all of a sudden there's somebody who actually has the honesty of saying, I'm not interested in that place. Before, and this is really the final thing that I'm going to say, before that, the Obama years were a wonderful case in point, but also the Bush years before this and even the Clinton years, the US was always in a bind because it had to do both things at the same time, but they were contradictory. It had, on the one hand, to tell the Europeans, you got to do more because we can't bail you out forever. You have to do more yourself so that this alliance can stay credible. And at the same time, it also had to say, we will always be there for you. Don't worry, America's guarantee is not, negotiable. Because if you say we're not there any longer, that's something that the Russians and the Chinese understand very well, and other powers as well. So they had to do both things. Press the Europeans, while at the same time reassuring them. That's not something that's easy to do. And you could see the very delicate dance that the American diplomats in Europe, especially in Brussels at NATO, were doing all the time, trying to do both stories at the same time. You got to do more, but don't worry, we will always be there. Undermining the first point by making the second. Now all of a sudden Trump comes in and says, you have to do more or we're gone. In a sense, you can say, finally, there is some clarity. The problem is that clarity comes at the expense of strategic depth. And, the ambiguity of America's role in Europe and the European strategic purpose is a very delicate game to play. And Mr. Trump is not known, as somebody who can play a delicate game, in a subtle way for very long. And this is why the Europeans are fundamentally worried, and I think rightfully so. But others in this country are just as worried because it not only would it undermine European security, but it would also undermine the credibility of America's role in the world. I think I stop here. I have talked enough, and hopefully you have a few questions that I can answer. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you.